Hello and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub online. Apologies for the slight delay, had some technical issues that we've now overcome. My name is Emma and I am a prison law solicitor and I will be your host for this evening. This event is put on by a collaboration of Skeptics groups throughout the land and beyond this land who have been putting on weekly events online for just about ever, it feels like, at this point. Exactly who or what a pub was or is has sadly been lost to the mists of time. But never mind, Skeptics in the Pub online is an entirely voluntary organisation, so if you do enjoy tonight's event and you're able to chuck us a few quid for the running costs and things like that, there will be a link on the screen and in the chat to do so. And that brings me on to some more housekeeping. Just a quick note about the chat. There is a chat box and it is moderated, so let's all be generally excellent to each other. And the moderators will be looking out for everyone and also posting useful information throughout. We also have a Discord server if you're interested in getting more involved in this community. And you can find more information about that at sitp.online/contact. We will follow the usual format tonight. We will have a talk for 45 minutes to an hour. There'll be a short break and then a Q&A. If you have any questions for the speaker, you can post those at sitp.online/ask. That, again, link will be in the chat throughout, so you don't need to remember it right now. So if you have any questions, do go there. And if you don't have a say in what gets asked, you can go there and vote on what questions you want to see answered. Finally, after Q&A, you can join us in our virtual imagining of whatever a pub was at the Lock-In's Razor, and links to that, again, will be in the chat. So, to our speaker today. Professor Phil Scraton is an emeritus professor at the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, and for me, the negation of the idea that you shouldn't meet your heroes. He is widely published in the area of prison, inquests and deaths in custody, and has conducted research throughout the world in those areas. From a skeptical perspective, he is well known for his tireless efforts in uncovering a real-life conspiracy theory, in bringing about the Hillsborough Independent Panel report in 2012, and subsequent inquests that led to unlawful killing verdicts for the 96 victims almost 30 years after the disaster, overturning decades of cover-up and lies. And for that, he was awarded the Freedom of Liverpool and turned down an OBE. Tonight, Phil is going to be talking about an idea that is dear to my heart, prisons, activism and abolition. And with that, I give you Professor Phil Scraton.
Hello, everybody. It's good to meet you virtually. I can't see you. You can't see me. We've had a few technical problems, but hopefully that won't make any difference to what I've got to say. I can now take my clothes off and talk quite freely. I wanted to start just by saying that who's in prison? England and Wales, 144 per 100,000. It's the 8th highest imprisonment rate in European countries. It's actually bettered only by Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. It's quite a remarkable issue that an advanced democratic society is punishing so many people by using prison. Of course, the worst example of this is the United States of America. What is remarkable is that in the last few years, while there has been a quite distinct drop in crime rates in our society, there has been a marked increase in imprisonment, so much so that the Victorian prisons that were going to be closed 20 years ago are still open and overcrowded. 49% of our prisons in May 2020 are formally overcrowded. And it's not cheap. If we think about this, £40,000 a year, well, £700 shy of £40,000 a year is what it costs to keep a prisoner in prison in England on average, 55,000 in the north of Ireland. And that's the average. So for those who are quadrupled up or those who are on lower sentences, it is quite remarkable because we're talking about some prisoners costing as much as £100,000 a year to keep in prison. Female prisoners, women, are only just 4% of the population, the prison population. But I'll be coming back to that issue in a short while. Of what would be classed as minority ethnic groups, 27% of the prison population are constituted of people from that description, which is twice as many of the proportion within the in the general population. A high proportion of prisoners have learning difficulties and disabilities. In the place I live, for example, Northern Ireland, 30% of our prisoners have learning difficulties or disabilities when compared and contrasted with 7% of the general population. 79% of women prisoners in the north of Ireland have previous traumatic brain injury, majority sustained as a result of childhood or partner physical abuse. Mental health problems in Northern Ireland, 31% of all newly committed prisoners are referred to mental health services. On committal during 2019, 51% of women disclosed mental health issues. Substance users, 7% of prisoners have current alcohol abuse, 33% substance misuse, and in 2019, 51% of our women prisoners actually reported self-reported drug use. That's just self-reporting. Quite clearly, right across all of the jurisdictions in the islands, the prisoners endure poorer physical health, lower levels of literacy, and lower levels of numeracy. One of the major demands for education in our prisons is basic literacy skills. During 2019 to 2020, 68% of female receptions here were actually on remand, went on to remand, and 45%, nearly half of our daily population, are on remand. In other words, they're innocent until they're proven guilty, and the majority of those do not get a prison sentence. So they serve a prison sentence, although they're either not given a prison sentence or they're innocent. 67% of receptions to the YOC, the Young Offenders Centre here, are on remand. And of that, 51% of the daily population is on remand. So they are not people with prison sentences, not people with proven cases to answer. The length of sentences, despite serious crime reducing, length of sentences, a 48% increase in 2020 compared to 2010. So we're sending prisoners to prison more readily, more quickly, and for longer for similar sentences. 86% of female receptions in 2019 were sentenced to less than 1 year in custody. In any other major European jurisdiction, none of those women would have been sent to prison. So that is a really quite incredible statistic. 77% of males receive sentences of 6 months or less. Again, would not receive sentences in most other European jurisdictions. That is a litany of catastrophe in terms of what we now know relating to prisons, the damage that prisons do to individuals, the damage they do to those who are in their families. And I will be talking about that this evening. So why am I not a reformist? I will be explaining that now. Why am I an abolitionist? I again will be explaining that now. Immediately, some of you will be switching off your computers and saying, oh, this is ridiculous. How could you abolish prisons? There are some very dangerous people. Well, there are. There's no question. And of course, something has to be done in those circumstances. But the litany, the statistics I've just given you, demonstrate absolutely clearly that the majority of those in prison are more of a danger to themselves than they are to others. So here we go. The panopticon. Most people, when they start studying prisons, they're taught about Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. There it is in the top left of your screen, the original plans, not very well drawn. And what is quite remarkable is that the panopticon has continued as a model. There to the right is an original United States prison. Down on the bottom left of your screens is, yes, Strangeways in Manchester. And here, still enduring after all these years, is one of the most modern prisons based on that idea of central observation down the wings of each corridor. That is the way in which we house prisoners. Of course, prisons come in all shapes and sizes, but the suffering in each of those prisons was well captured by Oscar Wilde. The vilest deeds, like poison weeds, bloom well in prison air. It is only what is good in man that wastes and withers there. Pale anguish keeps the heavy gate, and the warder is despair, for they starve the little frightened child till it weeps both night and day, and scourge the weak and flog the fool, and gibe the old and grey. Each narrow cell in which we dwell is a foul and dark latrine, and all but lust is turned to dust in humanity's machine. A century on, that could be written today. That which was Oscar Wilde's experiences that nearly drove him to take his own life. And he did wither in prison, dreadfully. So, what does Susan Sontag have to say about prisons? And what does she talk about how we marginalize others? She wasn't actually talking exclusively about prisoners when she was talking about us being proximate to other people's suffering. What to do, she asks, with such knowledge of faraway suffering? It seems normal for people to ignore the ordeals of others. We don't get it. We truly can't imagine how dreadful, how terrifying, and how normal it becomes. Can't understand, can't imagine. Of course, Susan Sontag was talking primarily about war. I'm talking about the war that is our prison system. Others, the ordeals of others. Of course, many of you know Simone de Beauvoir's wonderful book, The Second Sex, in which she talks about others, where she's talking specifically about women, who is defined and differentiated with reference to man. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. She is the other. That is such a well-known quote. If you turn the page, she talks about others. Blacks in the USA, indigenous, as she puts it, in the colonies, proletarians within capitalist societies. And I would add to that, prisoners within our so-called democratic society. So how do we understand and begin to share our knowledge of what happens inside a prison? The first thing that's important for me in the work that I do is to situate and locate the view from below. Almost all of our history is written from above. Much of our textbooks, much of our understanding is written from above. But what about our present as well as our history from below? It's important if we're to develop an inquiring mind, which is something that I consider is imperative and has been a great honor to have had that developed within me by my tutors, that the inquiring mind actually bears witness. It actually looks, it sees, it listens, it discovers. And we do that by hearing testimonies, to do what C. Wright Mills talked of, taking personal troubles and turning them into public issues. Those personal troubles we see in everyday life that are so significant when they're shared, when we see that others feel, experience the same way. They're public issues. And to do that, it's important and imperative to recover truth. What is truth? It's about building alternative accounts. It's about challenging those accounts that become part of official discourse. Official discourse, for me, has an implicit deceit, because it is a view from above, because it is based on a certain way of being. We must uncover and challenge the deceit of official discourse. And we must marry that, to go back to Susan Sontag, to regarding the pain of others. It seems, she says, that the appetite for pictures showing bodies in pain is as keen almost as the desire for ones that show bodies naked. The satisfaction of being able to look at the image without flinching. Perhaps the only people with the right to look at images of suffering of this extreme order are those who could do something to alleviate it. The rest of us, she says, are voyeurs, whether or not we mean to be. The gruesome invites us to be either spectators or cowards, unable to look. Unable to look. This is the same picture. The picture on the left of your screen is in Abu Ghraib. This is what the United States military considered to be appropriate behavior to those that they had as captives. He's wired up electrically. But the real picture that wasn't on 60 Minutes is on the right. That's a far more damning picture because it shows the complacency of the captor. He's on his mobile phone. Is he ringing Texas? Is he chatting to his loved one? Does he care about the suffering that is in front of him? The question isn't about him as an individual. The question is about how a regime can dehumanize to that level that the individual who is supposedly the captor stroke carer is indifferent to the suffering of the captured. Richard Quinney, a well-known radical criminologist in the United States, argues against prisons. He says separating people through the institution of the prison creates populations of wounded lives, inside the prison or outside the prison. This is the dance of the slave and the slaveholder, the inmate and captor, prisoner and non-prisoner. No one, he says, escapes the damage caused by the fact that prison exists. It's pervasive. It's economic, social, psychological, and spiritual. The injuries caused by the prison are shared by all. Every single one of you, this evening, watching these slides, this is your responsibility. You are part of that process, that pervasive process that Quinney is talking about, as am I. And the way I summarize that is that the pains of confinement are inflicted in our name. That phrase, not in our name, we have no choice because it's financed by the public purse. Every time we buy something and pay tax, every time we are taxed for something we do, we finance prisons. But beyond economic costs are the more profound consequences, the social, the political, and the emotional. Can we measure those in the same way as we measure how much it costs financially to keep an individual in prison? No, we can't. Irving Goffman, who I first read as a young student, it shows you how long ago it was, he made a very clear statement in his wonderful book at the time, Asylums. He said, the prisoner begins a series of abasements, degradations, humiliations, and profanations of self. In other words, the inner self, the core of the being, is destroyed. The barrier, he says, that total institutions place between the prisoner and the wider world marks the first curtailment of self. We literally lose ourselves. And years later, with Joe Sim and Paula Skidmore, when we analysed the uprisings in Scottish prisons in our book, Prisons Under Protests, it became very clear to us in taking evidence from so many of those long-term prisoners, precisely how Goffman's work resonated. The totality of the institution, we wrote, in terms of its political and professional autonomy is underwritten by a degree of totality or absolutism in power relations, which virtually strip the prisoner of civil rights, personal consultation, and democratic process. Prison is a total institution. It's walled in. Access is only granted to those whom the authorities want to grant it to. It is an island. In the words of so many prison researchers in Scandinavia, it is an archipelago, a sequence of islands linked together by roads and those small white vans with the little windows that scurry between the courts and the prisons and the prisons and the prisons. And it's done in our name. As my good friend and colleague Linda Moore and I wrote when we were doing our research here in the north of Ireland, our work is about asserting the right to know. It is investigative and it is revelatory. It bridges the inside-outside physical divide by informing the outside of what happens on the inside. It achieves not only the view from below, but the view from within. Reporting, recording, interpreting mind-numbing routines, as well as the harsh punishments and occasional cruelties that form the process of engagement with the prison as a total institution. Walls of the mind as well as walls that are physical. We bear witness to the humiliation and lack of self-determination normalized in the lives of the incarcerated. And it's a violent institution. This doesn't happen by chance. In this remarkable book by Barnes and Teeters, written in 1951 in the United States, they summarize precisely every experience I've had of being inside prisons across these islands, and in Australia, and in the United States, and in Canada. They say, many who know the prison cruelty attribute it to the deliberate viciousness and sadism of wardens, keepers, and guards. Yes, they say, there are brutal officials, but it is the institutional and routine aspects of prison administration and life, rather than the arbitrary personal sadism and depravity, which accounts for most of the cruelty and personal demoralization that goes on in our contemporary prisons. Imprisonment, they say, supplies the method of carrying out that revengeful spirit of an outraged society, bringing satisfaction for the wrongs, real or alleged, that are brought upon it by the offender, resulting in the release of cruel impulses by guards inured to their sadistic actions. This is incredible. It is 6 years after the end of the Second World War, when we saw the most incredibly vicious holding of prisoners right across the world by fascist regimes. But they are not talking about those regimes here. They're talking about imprisonment in the United States at the same time. The implicit violence that exists within institutions of imprisonment and incarceration. And why is that? Well, if I go back to Simone de Beauvoir's construct of other, and of course, primarily she was talking about woman as other, but if I go back to prisoner as other, Nelson Mandela summarizes it perfectly. Prison is designed to break one's spirit and destroy one's resolve. To do this, the authorities attempt to exploit every weakness, demolish every initiative, negate all signs of individuality, all with the idea of stamping out that spark that makes each of us human and each of us who we are. People survive prison despite the prison, not because of it. How can I speak with such certainty? I'll tell you why. I was 24 when I first went into Walton Prison to teach a class in Liverpool. I'll come back to that in a minute. I witnessed and wrote about with Joe Sim and Paula Skidmore the Peterhead Uprising. The Strange Ways Uprising happened as that book was being published. And of course, I've written and researched Strange Ways since. I witnessed an alternative in prison for long-term prisoners who were serving life sentences, seen to be supposedly the most dangerous men in Scotland, in the Barlinnie Special Unit. And there I met T.C. Campbell, who, when he was in Shotts, having been transferred out of Barlinnie, went on hunger strike because he was an innocent man. And also because he had been put into one of the hardest prison regimes in Scotland at the time, having been in a progressive regime in Barlinnie. I will never forget meeting him as he lay dying. He lay dying in the prison hospital. He could hardly move. I held his hand and I begged him to come off hunger strike. I had no right to do that except to say what I wanted to say, and I'd driven there just to say it. If you die a guilty man. If you live, let's see how far your case will go. A day later, he came off hunger strike, and several years later, he was released from prison, innocent. And deaths in custody have been part of my work since the very early days of working in prisons, and I'm proud to be a founder member of Inquest, now the most powerful and significant organisation in our islands for fighting for justice in prisons and in other situations where people lose their lives to those in authority. Since I've lived in the north of Ireland now for 17 years, I've worked on the Mournehouse Special Unit, which was a women's prison inside a male jail, Maghaberry. It was then transferred to Hydebank Wood, where it's a women's prison inside a male juvenile offenders institution. Written several reports along with Linda Moore. I've worked on Inside Out and on the Journal on Prisons by Prisoners, Inside Out in the United States. And of course, one of the most significant issues for me is to see prisons from the inside, not as human zoos. And I think that deflecting many of my students who want to go and see what it's like in a prison, we are not going to a zoo. If we go into prison to look, we should be going into prison to do. My very first experience of teaching class in Walton Prison, hair down my back, shades, collarless shirt, right to work badge, waistcoat. I suppose when I turned up at Walton, they were not really expecting a university tutor to look like that. But regardless of that, they kept me at the gate for half an hour, knowing that the prisoners would be waiting in class, losing their precious out-of-cell time, 1.5 hours a week. Escorted through the bowels of the Victorian prison that is Walton, I retched at the acrid stench of sewage, unwashed bodies, and half-eaten dinners. A step ahead, the guards embarked on a tirade of abuse and intimidation. They were talking to each other. Who the fuck does he think he is, coming in here from some college? Like they, meaning the prisoners, give a shit? they'll have him. Yeah, Nancy boy. Welcome to Walton Prison, mid-70s. I was shown into a dilapidated classroom without a comment or introduction, and they left, turning the key as they went. The anger in the room at the delay and the deliberate failure to unlock their fellow prisoners, a third of the class were not there, was immediate. And this was my induction to prison, now complete. I asked the naive question, where are the other fellas? They said, oh, they just didn't bother unlocking them. Half of us won't be here next week. That's the way they do it. And that institutional malaise has come through every piece of work that I have done ever since in these islands. A prison estate that is unfit for purpose. Management and staff not trained for purpose other than containment and control. Non-engagement with prisoners, deliberately only engaging with prisoners on prison officers, or as I would prefer to call them, guards' terms. Obstructive work practices, poor industrial relations, and a culture of impunity and denial. Prison officers literally as untouchables. The whole regime is geared to reaction rather than proaction. There is inadequate mental health care, visits, and certainly inadequate family contact. And when it happens, if it's on the phone, it's at full rate. Minimal out of cell time. Oh yeah, people will tell you that prisoners lounge around the prison all day long. Well, at the moment, most prisoners are locked down 23 hours out of 24, but that's not unusual. And at weekends, Saturdays, Sundays, when they are short on prison staff, out of cell time will be mainly an hour. Lack of constructive activities. Failures in oversight and monitoring. We've seen an increase in severe reports from the independent monitors going into prisons. That is something that is relatively recent, and it's to be welcomed and it's important. But they are taking a snapshot. They're in for the most a week or two at a time. And the independent monitoring boards themselves are only in, they're in every week, but they're only in for short periods. At the end of the day, I know that if anything happens to me, there'll be an investigation. I never ripped the mattress or blanket, nor did I block the spy. So if I take pneumonia, it'll all come out. I think you can only last 10 or 12 days without drinking, because then you dehydrate and your kidneys go. I've no intention of eating or drinking again, so they're beat there. I know they'll all love me dead, but I'd make sure everything is revealed first. And Annie died that week. She took her own life. I gave evidence at her inquest, and the prison was criticised for its lack of care. Of course, she took her own life, but the jury found that the prison had not cared for her. As with Frances McKeown, here in Hydebank Wood, this is the last entry in her diary on the evening that she took her own life. Today has been an okay week and day, except this evening the voices are getting really bad. I can't put up with them much more. There was a code blue, which is an emergency, tonight on the Wee Lads in Elm. Code blue is when someone has hung themselves and died, so we're all locked all night. It was a true observation. A young man had hung himself and died that evening. If these voices keep up, there'll be another code blue tonight. I already have a noose made and ready, but I can't do anything until the night staff do the alarms. Then I have an hour. I've got it planned, and tonight is the night. And it was. She had been waiting for a mental health referral for 6 weeks. As it was with Roseanne Irvine, whose inquest I also gave evidence at. And Ciara McCulloch came out of prison, but died young, just a few years ago. When I interviewed her, she was self-harmed from her shoulders to her wrists, from her hips to her feet. There was hardly a part of her body that wasn't scoured and bleeding. And she had a potty to go to the toilet in the corner. She had a canvas gown that was held together with sellotape. And she was not allowed knickers. And she lived on a strip bed with the mattress taken out and the concrete plinth remaining through the day. I stood in her cell with Linda. I could not believe my eyes. She said, "It's worse in the night. I hear voices and see things. They tell me to cut myself. And I release the pain as well. I tried to hang myself. No one helps me. I've had no counseling since I've been in here." Articulate, a great artist, a lovely young woman who died in her late 20s. And one of the great moments in my work was the day that her family contacted me when she died to thank me for the years that she'd had when she came out of prison. I didn't do that. She did that. And that's what I told them. And more recently, although his death was in 2013, James Rainey was arrested trying to break into a shop. His mental health was so severe, probably because of drugs, that the police refused to release him to the prison and kept him under observation in the police cell. He was released to Hyde Bank Wood Young Offenders Centre on the 9th of April 2013. On the day he was released, on the day that he was released from prison custody, police custody, a letter went with him to the prison, explaining the situation over the previous days. It was never opened. As he arrived, his interview lasted no more than a minute. All of the protocols were ignored. He was put on the wings, and he was left in a distressed state. He asked for a pen and paper. He was given a pen and paper, and he went to his cell, where he was last seen writing. He was writing a suicide note. Once lockup came, he hung himself with his bed sheets. And 10 days later, he died in hospital when the life support was withdrawn. James Rainey died a lonely death, an avoidable death. It was investigated by the prisoner ombudsman twice in 2014 and 2015, and working with his solicitors, we sent both reports back. They were inadequate. His inquest was held between the 3rd and the 14th of February in 2020. By now, not only did we have a very strong family working towards a resolution, but I brought one of the Hillsborough lawyers over, and also, or she came over, and one of the most significant barristers, solicitors here in the north of Ireland for working on these cases. The verdict lasted the court lasted 10 days. And the narrative verdict was yes, of course, he took his own life. But there were 15 institutional failures in the time between his arrival at the prison and his death. His death was avoidable. There was a demonstrable lack of care. That case, more than any, demonstrates how clearly prisons are not appropriate places for those who are going through mental ill health problems. But like with the Rainey family, it's not only the imprisonment, the actual act of imprisoning an individual. There is also a virtual prison, the prison within the family, who experience individual, social, economic hardship, who live in the society in which we live with that reputational issue of being the family of a prisoner, who have to make whatever sacrifices they can to get to the prison to see their loved one. Here in the north of Ireland, if they go up the coast to McGilligan, it can take 4 changes of public transport. It can take a day to get there and back for a 40-minute interview, trailing the children to see their father. The virtual prison exists within our community, both interpersonal and institutional. And I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about the way in which those who live within the community with a negative reputation of having been a former prisoner, how they are interpersonally shunned and institutionally barred. And of course, the media, including social networks, and the damage that is done in the virtual prison to the reputation of individuals who read about themselves in the most malicious coverage. How do you negotiate prison reality? How, when you're a prisoner locked away for so many hours of every day, do you maintain meaningful contact with your loved ones? How do you provide for your family, man or woman? Experiencing the visits, getting dressed up to see in your best prison clothes, to see your loved ones for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, maximum of an hour. Experiencing the family visit, with children not able to understand why they can't sit on their parents' knee. The stigma, the humiliation, the shame that is part of being a prisoner and former prisoner. And whether on release there is effective transition or support. In actual fact, many of the hostels that we have are little more than extensions of prison life. And yet we read of penal reformism, that will reform the prisoner, that will make better people as they leave. And we've seen from the statistics that that is an abject failure. The World Health Organization talk about the creation of a healthy prison. In my nearly 50 years of going in prisons, I have never experienced those 2 words as being appropriately put together. Healthy prison. They talk about the 4 principles on which our prisons are now inspected: safety, respect, purposeful activity, and resettlement. How does safety become a priority when custody and control dominates? How can you have respect when prisoners are treated with contempt? Where is the purposeful activity other than that engineered primarily by prisoners themselves? I was in Scotland talking to a prisoner who, in a one-off case, had taken the life of somebody else. It wasn't a planned murder, but he had a long sentence of 20 years. He had a family that stood by him. He had children. He'd done an open university course. He'd followed it up with a master's course. He was now working towards a PhD. He'd done everything that was asked of him. He was nearly 9 years into the sentence. And he asked the governor, "What can I do now?" And the governor replied, "Blend with the woodwork. Sorry, blend with the wallpaper." There is no wallpaper in prison, but blend with the wallpaper. What does that say about purposeful activity? And then the resettlement myth, the diversity of different organizations that are involved in the process of resettlement, some of them excellent, some of them not. But whose responsibility is resettlement beyond the prisoner? Who gives that opportunity? Some of you will know the Clark's shoe shops have a long history of taking on former prisoners. Why is that not more broadly shared? Only this week, I had to fight tooth and nail to get the Scottish Football Association to accept the manager of Livingston FC into a permanent post, because 10 years ago he was released from prison after a serious offence. And it looked very much as though his appeal would be turned down. That should be seen as a remarkable success, a success that he has achieved himself. But no, that idea of what will people think? How can we possibly reward? No, it's not reward. It's about a rightful appointment for a person who is qualified for the post. And that is the deceit of the 3 R's, how easy they trip off the tongue in prisons. Rehabilitation, resettlement, and reintegration back into society. Only a minority of prisoners are assisted fully in that process. Meanwhile, the politics of the prison and its aftermath are the politics of control, how agencies and even prison research is managed, who is allowed into prison to do research, which agencies are allowed to work with prisoners while they're in prison. And of course, a prison isolates and punishes vulnerability. The combination of mental ill health, which I've already talked about, as preeminent across our prisons, and the cognitive behavior therapy fallacy. 1 hour a week, cognitive behavior therapy, away from your cell. You return to your cell with the instruction that you can't talk to anybody, share with anybody the discussion you've just had with your therapist. That isolation becomes even more emphasized in those forms of treatments. And of course, as I've already mentioned, the resistance to effective monitoring and accountability. And what Jude McCulloch, professor in Australia, and myself, in terms of our international work, have argued, is that penal reformism is dominated by the politics of incorporation. For abolitionists, contemporary reformism, however well-intentioned, we argued, facilitates a politics of incorporation, which places of detention become rights compliant. Their managers and staff gain rights, management and protection diplomas, and independent monitors annually report their visits and inspections. But we argue and we demonstrate in the work, the interjurisdictional work, that the violence of incarceration is historically, socially, and culturally imprinted on the foundations of the prison. It is moderated or hidden beneath a veneer of mission statements, glossy brochures, and internet virtual tours. Some days I can hardly differentiate between that veneer as they apply to prisons and the one that is applied to the university in which I work. So, what do you suggest? Well, the obvious answer is decarceration. Think of the funding that we could spend, that 50,000 a year per head, in appropriate alternatives, when so many of our prisoners are sentenced to terms imprisonment that they would not get in any other jurisdiction. And it is more expensive to have that revolving door. Angela Davis argues that the major challenge is that we should, first of all, see prisons as a last resort. That's actually written into all international documents. That they should be humane, habitable environments, but without bolstering the permanence of the prison system. The justice system to be based on reparation and reconciliation, rather than as it is at present on retribution and vengeance. That has to be underpinned by what she calls a constellation of alternative strategies, the revitalization of community-based education at all levels. Look at the decline in youth work in our societies over the last 2 decades. Universal, free, physical and mental health care in the community, supporting those who need to be saved not only from what they might do to others, but what they might do to themselves. That is the genesis of decarceration. And decarceration is a gradual approach to abolishing the concept of prison as we know it. In order to reach that, we can't ignore the inequalities of our society brought into stark relief by the COVID crisis. But those of us working in communities knew that already. Poverty has to be ended. Essential services must be secured. All community voices must be heard through inclusive and active participation. The celebration of diversity, the defeating of discrimination. And rather than play to a media that hypes fear, to actually challenge fear. And it sounds to us a kind of liberal term, but there has to be hope. And hope is not a religious term. Hope is a material term. It's created through material opportunity. That is a more equal and just society. To achieve this, we have to promote critical thought and action. And that can only be reached by dialogue, an informed dialogue. And to that end, we secure economic, social, and cultural rights. As Dina Hayden and I wrote years ago, the struggle for rights and justice requires a fundamental shift in structural relations and the determining contexts of power, which marginalize and exclude from effective participation. No more marginalized, no more excluded are those in prison. My final point, the personal is always political. There is no personal without the political, and there's no political without us. We have to respect the uniqueness of every life, of every person held in our jails. and in our special hospitals. We have to ensure that the view from inside, the daily life, the tribulations, the trials of daily life, from all those who are in prison, whether they are prisoners or workers, that view from inside is heard. We have to, in wider society, value difference rather than denigrate difference. That is how resistance is strengthened. To do this, to quote from Frigga Haag, the French philosopher, we must do memory work. We must understand the history of how we got to where we are now and what that means. I tried to do that this evening by talking through those early days of incarceration. I always put agency in inverted commas because we don't all have equal agency. When researchers talk about the agency of prisoners, what are they talking about? When somebody is locked down, they're every day determined by the actions of others. Agency is the freedom I have through having a decent job, a decent standard of life, and the ability to take time out, to do other things, to enjoy my family life. I have greater agency than those who only a few streets away from me during this period of COVID are locked down with their families, with no money, no future, no jobs. And that's even before I talk about the agency that is taken from the prisoner. But the hope comes from us, as being agents not only of conflict, but also agents of change. And change starts the minute you decide to open your minds, to open our minds to an alternative view of what a prison is, who prisoners are, and how we can work towards decarceration and the eventual abolition of that which is known to us as prison. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Phil. If you could hear the chat, you would hear rapturous applause. I think it was a very powerful talk, fascinating and horrifying stuff in equal measure. Sadly, a lot of it's quite familiar stuff to me. Your description of Walton Jail sounds like you were there yesterday. So we're going to have a short break now, but just a little more housekeeping. In a few week's time, we are hosting a talk by Dean Burnett about the science of mental health. And as part of that, he is going to be talking about dodgy stuff that we all hear about mental health. And so he would like to hear from us what the most annoying mental health tropes and claims are that you've heard out there. You can let Dean know these via all of the usual methods of contacting Skeptics in the Pub through our social media, all the ways that are available on our contact page, sitp.online/contact. So get those pet hates and bugbears in. So now we're going to have a short break. We're going to come back at 8:20 for the Q&A, and do get your questions in between now and then if you haven't already, and we'll see you soon. Welcome back. I hope that everyone is all suitably refreshed and relieved. So we've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to jump straight into it. So first of all, question from Cleo. She says, thank you for firming up my views. How could we manage people who are violent and dangerous and whose freedom will negatively impact others?
I think that's a really important question. It's the one that you're always asked first. So thank you for asking it first. The thing I would say is that, first of all, that it is the extreme. It is a relatively short number, a small number of people who are in prison for acts of real violence. Those who are, especially men, who are imprisoned for violence against women. And we only today are seeing that the statistics for charging and prosecuting men for rape have fallen incredibly since the legislative changes 2 years ago. So I'm very well aware of that issue, and I think it is really an important question. Clearly, those who are danger to others cannot be in wider society, and certainly in the present climate, before we move into a transitionary period of decarceration, they can't be held in they can't be in wider society. What I would prefer to see is clearly, this is the whole point of decarceration, that they are held in restricted circumstances, which I would prefer not to call a prison. People will still call it a prison, but I would prefer detention to be detention rather than prison, because that gives us the opportunity to then think differently about different forms of detention. So what I'm actually getting to is that those people who are either a danger to others or a danger to themselves, to the extent that they will never be allowed, it would never be able to bring them back into wider society, obviously, clearly must be detained. And they must be detained in circumstances that are safe for others, but also detained in circumstances that are humane. They lose their liberty as the punishment, and then all the work that is done with them, therapeutic, etc., is done within the confines of their incarceration. There is no question in my mind that we would never, ever, I would never countenance a situation where a person who is a danger to others, whether that is to their partners or to wider society or to children, I would never countenance a situation where they are released into open society and where therapeutic alternatives can be developed. And nor do those societies in which progressive regimes operate, nor do they. But what it is important is to use incarceration as a place of humane detention for those who are deemed to have such serious issues that they cannot, or their crimes, in inverted commas, are so great that they are a great risk to others as well as to themselves, that they have to be held in detention. This is always the question that comes up, because people say, aha, so you don't want to abolish prisons. And I argue, I want to abolish prisons as we know them. But that doesn't mean that in these cases, which are a minority of cases and a growing minority, if legislative change is brought about to prosecute more of those men who commit acts of rape, for example, then in that situation, incarceration has to be the only way of dealing with them. They cannot be dealt with in the community. So I want to be very clear about that and clear that issue out of the way, because that is still a minority issue, because the majority of those who go to prison for much lesser offences. You heard me say that up to 50% of those incarcerated are given a sentence of less than a year, certainly less than 2 years, and would not get sentences in other societies. So we have to build this broad range of alternatives to prison, but it has to be appropriately financed. How is that going to be financed? Well, I can tell you £50,000 a year per head goes a long way in terms of building a suite of alternatives to create a situation where the majority of those who go to prison can stay in their communities with community-based support. Also, just want to finish on that by saying you have to remember there are an awful lot of people in communities who never get a prison sentence, but who have committed offences. And that is an important issue. We can't talk about offenders as only being those people who are in prisons. We all offend at certain points in our lives. And you say, oh, well, Phil, that's just like you're now just this is a red herring. No, it's not. We all offend at different points in our lives, and all of us at various points in our lives need to be supported through those issues.
Yeah, I think I would just echo that in terms of, obviously, through my work, I represent people in parole proceedings where we're determining whether or not someone is a risk. And then the number of people who are considered risky in terms of violence with the whole prison population is very small. And there's only a very small number of those people who are considered so dangerous as to never be released. So it's, I would agree entirely with all of that in terms of those people need to be detained, but they could be detained in much more humane conditions than they currently are. So speaking of more humane conditions, which countries do you think have the best prison systems? Do you think it'd be realistic at all to copy them? Are there any reasons why they wouldn't work in the UK?
Well, always the argument has always been proposed that Scandinavia, and not all Scandinavian states are the same, but certainly the more progressive regimes have been those in Scandinavia and traditionally in the Netherlands as well. And some of the leading prison abolitionists have come from those states. So there are alternatives. I mean, you know, we also have to remember we have an extremely low age of criminal responsibility in our society. So we are punitive right from the get-go. And I think that when we look at those societies, and I've worked with families in those societies, particularly with young people, where proper therapeutic interventions have turned young people's lives round. And I think that we have to learn from that. But of course, it's very difficult because we are much more in line. We are much more in line with the punitivity that exists in the United States. Not as severe, but certainly more in line. And, you know, people have all sorts of explanations for this. Is it something to do with being Anglo-Saxon? Is it, where does that punitivity come from in our psyche? And so on and so forth. But there has always been an abolitionist movement. I mean, if we look back to the Victorian times, there were great abolitionists who could see that the way forward, and many of them were religious actually, but they could see that the way forward was to work with people in the community rather than to take them from the community and punish them harshly. Because obviously in that situation, you're damaging somebody who you're punishing. You know, I mean, it's not just the lockdown period where people are in prison for 23 hours out of 24. If you lock people up in a confined space, as many people in the community going through COVID are beginning to realize, if you lock people up in a confined space, in a punitive environment, you exacerbate mental ill health. One of the worst statistics is to see how many people who go into prison are transferred into Broadmoor Special Hospital each year because they literally lose their mind in prison. That cannot be appropriate. You know, when you're sentenced to prison, maybe 4 years, 5 years, yes, a relatively serious offence, although that would carry in Scandinavian countries probably 18 months or 2 years. But once you are transferred, once you're placed in that punitive environment, how do we expect that somebody is in a period of great self-reflection and can actually the phrase is used as come to terms with their crime? When I was dealing with the whole process of David Martindale being appointed as manager of Livingston FC, and the Scottish FA resisting this and saying, "Oh no, he has a criminal record, blah blah. He was all right to be a temporary manager, but we can't give him a permanent post 10 years on." I was saying to them, "Don't you realise you're dealing here with a guy who's one of the great success stories of the system, who, despite the system, has got himself a university degree, has got himself his coaching badges, and is now settled back into society." And that it's trying to alter that punitive lens through which people view all of our society, that judgmental lens, and to think, what am I trying to create here? One of the guys that I work with here runs the educational Shakespeare company in Northern Ireland, who will tell people from the rooftops about his prison record, has made a massive contribution to Northern Ireland in the arts, a massive contribution. Is a remarkable person. Others who are great playwrights, great authors. And we should be looking at this and saying, well, if it can succeed for them, it can succeed for others. And they've done that through self-determination in a hostile environment. If we had a more progressive system, I am absolutely convinced that the revolving door of people coming out, having no job, living in dislocated circumstances, sofa surfing, getting into more difficulty, taking drugs, getting back into prison. And remember that drugs is one of the biggest single factors now in incarceration, and also stealing in order to maintain a drugs habit. So in that situation, the cycle is so obvious. Some days I sit there and I think, I know the regimes. I know the environments. I know the people who work in them. I know the prisoners and the former prisoners. It all seems so straightforward. And yet still we are determined to hold on to that punitive mentality. Not just that the punishment must fit the crime, but we must punish and punish and punish again. Where is that notion of redemption? Where is that notion of people being judged by the worst thing that they ever did in their lives? If I was judged on the worst thing I ever did in my life, where would I be now? I wouldn't be sitting here having this discussion, for sure.
Yes, and I wonder how many of us would be. It also reminds me of we should be prisoners for people who we are scared of, not who we are angry or upset with. Although I don't think prison should exist at all. There's a question here from Anonymous. Dostoevsky said, the degree of civilization in a society is revealed by entering its prisons. Prisoners must have the right to vote. Do you agree?
Yeah, no question. I think that when you go to prison, you do not lose your citizenship. Your access to freedom is what you lose. And freedom to vote isn't a freedom, it's a right. And therefore, prisoners should have the vote, always. No question in my mind. Some of the most reflective and understanding people I've met in prison. And of course, I live in a society where once a prisoner was elected to Parliament in recent times, Bobby Sands. So, of course, there is no question in my mind. We should not lose the right to citizenship simply because of the worst thing that we've done.
Yeah, I would say that I absolutely agree with that. It's interesting. I was in talking about an independent review going on at the moment about the UK's membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the prisoner voting issue is one of the big ones that I go to when people talk about sort of human rights taking over and controlling everything the UK gets to do, because the European Court of Human Rights said in 2005 that there should be a blanket ban on prisoners being allowed to vote. And the government have still, 15 years later, not done anything about that. They've made some very weak proposals, but they still haven't done anything about it. And but they absolutely should be allowed to vote. Back in 2005, I think, when that case was happening, one of the prison newspapers ran a pretend election to see how people would vote if they were allowed to. And first of all, the turnout was appalling, as it is for all elections. but right-wing parties would have won in a landslide, which I always find interesting that like the Conservative Party always assume that prisoners voting would be a bad thing for them. But anyway, that's my bugbear. So someone who's definitely not me has asked, abolition is the ideal. While we seek that, what one concrete thing would you change about the current prison regime to make things better?
You can't change one thing without changing others. And that sounds like a really mealy-mouthed answer. There has to be proper reception in the community and proper facilities in the community. The halfway houses that we have, which are understaffed, they're not fully financed, they're not appropriately staffed, are to a large extent dangerous places. The dangerous places because people are not occupied, they don't have the opportunity to work in a therapeutic environment in most cases, not all, but in most cases. So in that situation, you have to put in place a suite of alternatives, as Angela Davis puts it, in our communities that are alternatives to prison, so that people are not sent to prison, but it's like attendance centres, but it's also where there is full professional support. And if they, probably as well as I do, I mean, the issue of bail hostels is a really serious issue. They're underfunded, they're understaffed. There is not the appropriate therapeutic support that's needed. So we need to invest in alternatives. Once those alternatives are in place, we can then begin to decant the prisons. In other words, not bring people necessarily out of prison, but not send them to prisons. And it's very interesting, there has been a reduction. There has been a reduction in prison sentences recently here. And that is directly because of a reluctance of judges to imprison people during a period of COVID. So what is happening to them? What are the alternatives that are put in place? And we've seen them, wearing bracelets, all of this sort of stuff, and so on. But, we have to deal with that. The other really burning issue that I started with was the amount of people who are on remand. We have nearly half of our female prison population in Northern Ireland are on remand. The majority of them will not receive a prison sentence. So they're serving time on remand without a charge being won against them, a prosecution being won against them. So those issues about dealing, if we're going to make strides, we need to start with those much more straightforward wins. And the straightforward wins are at that end of the sequence, where we have, I would say that the majority of those who are serving under 2 years shouldn't receive a prison sentence anyway. Most of them will be released after a year. So why haven't we got the wit to actually have appropriate attendance centres with appropriate opportunities for people to make a new start in their life? They will not make a new start languishing in a jail where often they're locked down for 23 hours out of 24.
Yeah, half, and you get half an hour, and then that time you have to choose, do I get a shower or a phone? The other issue we've got at the moment with people on remand is only getting worse because of COVID. Has caused an enormous backlog in the prison system. Sorry, absolutely. That's not true. There was already a massive backlog in the court system. It has been made significantly worse by absolutely. COVID. So there's an increasing remand population throughout the prison estate, which is not ideal. And in terms of bail hostels or approved premises, as they get called, they are terrible, but even the terrible provision we have, there's nowhere near enough of them. My clients who have to be released somewhere like that at the moment are getting release dates in November is the earliest places available in some parts of the country. And just on a final point, the one small concrete thing I would change is give prisoners free access to phone calls. And phones in their own cells to call their family and to call me. That would make things a lot easier. But 10 months into a pandemic, and there are some prisons where you still can't get remote access to your client. Question here. I'd
just like to give a non-COVID example of that. I've never forgotten the moment when I was standing in a prison talking to a guy and he said, "Oh, it's my turn for the phone." He went and paid the full BT telephone rate to use a public phone in front of people around him to phone his family. And in terms of the time, he came off in tears and he said to me, "I had to speak to my partner and my 3 children. And my partner said to the children, 'You can have 2 minutes with your dad each.'" And he said, and of course, the kids were trying to talk to him about their school, about what they'd done in the day, about, all the things that children talk to their parents about. And he just said, "They are serving this sentence with me." And I think it was one of the points I made in the talk, people forget that. And, I know people will say, well, he should have thought about that when he committed whatever crime it was. That is irrelevant. The inhumanity that is wreaked on families in those situations is appalling. So yes, you're right. Free and open access to telephones has long been a bugbear, and not just during the pandemic.
Just off piece for a second. There's a comment in the chat about me potentially regretting having prisoners be able to call me whenever they want. I say no, it's my job to speak to them, and obviously I'm not going to have my phone on in the middle of the night. So question here from someone called Karen McClaw, no idea who she is. How would you approach discussion with those who say the victims of crime are often forgotten about when talking about prisons and the treatment of prisoners?
Yeah, well, I would say I understand the question. Of course, I understand the question, but I'm the last person to forget those people who have suffered in terms of the extent of crime. With my other hat on, I spent 30 years demonstrating the crime that was Hillsborough. So, I'm in that situation, understand the issues around those who are perpetrators of criminal activity. I think that working as I do with those people who are victims of criminal activity, I am one. Most of us are. I would say very, very clearly that we do not help those victims by actually instituting a level of vindictiveness and a level of almost hatred against those who are in prisons. I mean, obviously, people will always go for the heinous crime, the dreadful situation. But if we can just say, yeah, okay, I get that, I understand that. But if we look at the majority of crimes, those victims, and it's most of us are victims at one point or another. I would prefer to use the word survivors because we do our best to survive the crimes that have been inflicted on us. That in that situation, the path forward is to help people, to strengthen people, to help them move as they want to move from their victimhood into a survival mode. And I think that, we've seen some extraordinary examples. The Brighton bomber, for example, meeting with the daughter of one of those who was killed by the Brighton bomb very publicly in order to revisit and understand the circumstances that took her father and others away. And it's very difficult to say to people who've suffered that extremity that that's what they should do. But certainly that was an incredible example, a really stark example, and I've seen many others, of levels of not just forgiveness in the simple sense of the word, but accommodation of where a person has moved to in the meantime.
Sorry there, classic faux pas of these times. Couldn't find my mute button. What do you see as the advantage of using abolition language rather than reform language when persuading people to this point of view?
Well, I explained it. I think the problem with reform language is it's not just language. It is actually policy. And the World Health Organization's language of reform takes us nowhere. You know, it's lip service to reform, it's lip service to rehabilitation, and it's lip service to reintegration. We more or less put all the onus on the prisoner to literally change themselves, both in prison and when they leave. Well, that's impossible. If we have a suite of alternatives of people who go to prison, where we build in support and we build in a function of them becoming or realizing that they can live a different life, then we do that without the punitive, if you like, the punitive shadow hanging over it. We had a system here in youth justice where young people who'd committed offences could opt to have a major discussion with those who they'd offended against, if those they offended against agreed to it, plus supported. You know, it's that sort of exact example of restorative justice, where those who had been offended against, they would confront them, but with those in authority administering it. If they didn't accept it, they would go to prison. So for lesser offences, it was seen as a way forward. But what struck me was the speed at which that became a punitive process. It didn't become a helping, sharing, supportive process. A few exceptions to that, but on the whole, it didn't. So in the point I'm trying to get to is that we have to look at ways that reparation can be developed. I don't mean financial reparation, can be developed in terms of people understanding the damage that has been done and confronting that damage.
Okay. You've spent a lot about the damage that you think the prison does, both to those that are there and to society at large. Question for Anonymous: would capital punishment be a more humane alternative?
It always comes up, doesn't it? I mean, you know, for what? Capital punishment for what? Is the question relating to somebody who's taken a life? I can tell you now that the likes of T.C. Campbell would have long been dead if we'd had capital punishment. It's not just an issue of victim of how many false narratives there now are, how much we have been able to demonstrate that people who have been convicted of heinous crimes actually were innocent. You know, I was working only recently on the New York jogger case. You know, 5 men, all innocent, all did long terms. You know, completely innocent. What would have happened to the Guildford 4? What would have happened to the Birmingham 6? You know, these are so that argument about false convictions is serious enough. But the real serious enough, do we need to be defined by state murder? Do we actually, you know, if we take a life, it is defined as murder. If the state takes a life, it is portrayed as execution. It is state murder. It is taking a life. And I'm not saying this from a religious perspective. I'm saying this from a pragmatic political perspective. So the answer is never, ever to go down the line of taking a life, because once we agree to it, as we're seeing in the United States, the next question is, where do we draw the line? Do we go back to pre-Victorian times when there were over 30 offences for which you could be executed? You know, each of those have been gradually whittled away until now execution no longer exists. So I've given it a bit of space. I've given it a bit of airtime. I've spent some of my lung capacity answering the question because I assume it's asked in good faith. But, you know, I thought we'd moved on. We are better than that.
Oh, I would hope so, but we'll see. One of the most concerning the opinion that correlated most highly with a desire to leave the European Union was the belief that there should be the reimposition of the death penalty. And we know what happened with the first question, so I do hope that doesn't come to pass. Around those lines, how can we move public dialogue on from this sort of the prison works mentality that politicians often have, especially ones in the current government? Is it access to information about the reality or something more fundamental?
Yeah, I think that the first thing is access to information. It is there, everybody can receive it, but equally they can receive just as much fake news, just as much fake statistics as they will if they look at the real news and the real statistics. So yes, it has to be that there has to be other strategies. I think that it's always been I know, I can go. I would never define myself as hero, but in terms of Hillsborough, where after many years of being castigated by so many people, I suddenly became defined as some form of hero of Hillsborough kind of thing. So you go from that status where people look up to what you've done to zero when you start talking about prisons, and yet you're the same person. You're the same person with the same brain and the same ideas and the same research capacity. And it seems to me to be pretty obvious, not to say that I'm always right, obviously not, but to say that people should really give some thought as to why those of us like yourself who go into prisons regularly, who work with prisoners regularly, whose whole life is geared to complex legal cases, why those of us who do the hard yards of research and work, we're not doing this for fun. We're not doing this because we want to make friends. We're doing this because we want to improve the society in which we live. We want to create a society that is a greater dynamic of humanity. We're not priests, but what we are, or priestesses, but what we are people who are attempting to develop a dialogue that's not an intellectual dialogue, but is a political dialogue about the politics of crime and the politics of punishment. And that is the dynamic that we can't just hide behind those negative, vicious ideologies that are there within many politicians, there within many parts of our society until people become directly affected themselves, and are there at the heart of some of our religions. We have to take a humanitarian approach to everything that we do, whether it's the person who is lonely in their house tonight, 6 houses away from where I'm living, and could be taking her own life because of that loneliness and isolation and poverty in the wake of COVID, or it's a prisoner. They are both victims of a system and a process. And I'm not in the business of putting them in a hierarchy of who deserves most. They are both suffering. And as a consequence, our society suffers. We suffer. Our communities suffer.
Can't say anything except I agree entirely. And if the crime rate is down while prison rate is up, isn't that proof that prisons are working?
Oh, great question. Great question. Absolutely brilliant question. No, because the crime rate is down because of a whole range of strategies within communities that is mainly community-based to challenge low-level criminality in those societies. So that's why the crime rate is down. The exceptions being, of course, crimes of a sexual nature and domestic violence, where we're beginning to appreciate that at the moment those rates of violence are increasing. So no, that's not direct correlation to prisons. In actual fact, there has been no change. In fact, it's worse now. There's been only negative change in people being released from prison and going back into prison. In other words, as I referred to it before, the revolving door. So the best test of whether prisons are operationally sound for those who are in prison is whether or not somebody returns to prison. And we have an immensely high, one of the highest rates in democratic societies of recidivism. That's the measure that should be being looked at. And in fact, that's increasing. If recidivism was down, I would agree. But recidivism is increasing. And therefore, that leads us to demonstrate that what is actually happening in prison is not equipping people to live in society. I mean, whoever asked that question, I'd just say to you, just think for a minute about what a 23-hour lockdown in overcrowded conditions with poor food, no work opportunities, no learning opportunities, maybe a TV in your cell, maybe a radio in your cell, in a situation where there is real hostility through overcrowding in a Victorian place where you actually carry the excrement that you have put into the piss pot in your cell alongside your co-prisoner. You carry that and slop it out every morning. How on earth could that environment prepare anybody for a return to society? The answer, of course, is, oh, well, that'll teach them. They won't come back again. But the problem with that is they do come back again. And they don't come back because of choice. They come back because of poverty, because of drugs, because of alcoholism, and because of the fundamental breakdown in our society for so many people, which is now worsening and will increase over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think I'd just point out that example you gave of slopping out, it sounds like it's an archaic example, but it's not. It's happening now because plenty of people are locked in cells that don't have toilets in them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you think that universal basic income would reduce the need for prisons?
Yeah, no question. I mean, we have to. I mean, if we just leave prisons to one side for a moment and think about the situation we're in, never in my lifetime, and I've thought during periods of crisis and 3-day working weeks and all of that. Yeah, I'm that old. That in my lifetime, I never thought that I would see a day when the distinction between people who are in my position, middle class, nice home, decent income, food on the table, space, reasonably good health, when that would be aspirational for people who can't feed themselves out of their basic income. This week, a woman took her own life and left a note to that effect because she'd been turned down on basic income credits, in fact. The situation in the communities that I go into and work in, and I might say come from myself, those communities, this would be my mother and my father I'm talking about, today, in those communities, having to be fed from food banks, having to live in houses that are ill-equipped, where the heating is poor, where the damp is exceptional, where their children are now at home full time. And I don't want to hear anybody saying if they can't look after their kids, they shouldn't have had them in the first place. That wasn't the deal that they signed. And in that situation, it's absolutely crystal clear when I walk into those homes myself and I see families in those dreadful situations trying to do schoolwork around a mobile phone with 3 or 4 children. This is the whirlwind that is to be yet reaped. And it has been building to this. It's taken an international pandemic to reveal what is really been going on, because we had food banks before the pandemic. We had that level of economic deprivation before the pandemic. And we had the celebration of celebrity and high finance and all that went with that at the other end of the spectrum. And people in those situations do take their own lives. And if they don't take their own lives, their life expectancy is 15 years less than mine. So, it's pretty obvious that we live at a time of increasing deprivation, and that will lead to both greater suicide on the one hand, but also to greater levels of acquisitive crime.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a final question now. You've answered a lot of them. There's still a lot left, but it is 9 o'clock, so we're going to have one more before we all go to the virtual pub. Andrew asks, in the midst of all the misery, do you have any amusing anecdotes which have brought a smile to your face in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I've got lots of little ones, lots of little kind of moments, because it is miserable, and it's miserable doing the work. The experience I gave of going into Kira's cell was a real low moment. The experience of seeing T.C. Campbell near to death was a real low moment. I'd just say that in both those cases, I came out of the prison, and as I was leaving the prison after being in Kira's cell, the prison officer or the guard who had taken me in said, well, what did you think? I said, it's an outrage, and I'm going to make sure that she gets out of that cell. He said, yeah, who do you think you are? And I said, I'm Phil Scraton. And he said, don't be funny with me. He said, you'll never be able to prove it. And I took the tape recorder out of my pocket and said, are you sure about that? He said, how did you get that in? I said, in my pocket. Your search system isn't really that good, is it? We had Kira out of that cell within 24 hours. T.C. Campbell, who was dying on the bed, I came out of the cell and I got in my car, picked up a sandwich at a local motorway services and drove straight to the Scottish prison headquarters and demanded to see whoever was the most senior person on duty. And I said to him, I'm not even going to discuss with you, but if he dies in that cell, this will be a death that is due to your process. And both of those situations ended positively. But that is just simply because you're there at the time. So it's midsummer, Australia. Barwon Prison is in a desert, literally in the desert. And when you get there, if it's 100 degrees in Melbourne, it feels like 120 there. You get out of the car, and before you've walked in through the prison gates, your shirt is already stuck to you. So you turn up in this prison, and they're looking down at you from on high. You already feel small. And I'm there with Bree Carlton, who is an academic in Dr. Bree Carlton. She's an academic and prison researcher in Australia. Because she's relatively small and a woman, I don't know who they thought she was. And the guy said to me, is Dr. Carlton coming with you as well? I said, she's standing right next to me. So we were already off on the wrong foot. So he said, well, you're going over to see, one of the most notorious prisoners in our history. And I said, that notorious prisoner who's done all the reform stuff he's been supposed to do, finished his BA, his MA, now has a PhD. he looked like somebody out of ZZ Top. His hair, he'd never cut his hair since he'd been in prison. And he was a long way into his sentence. So we had to go into this dry area, which is an area between the outer doors of the prison and the inner doors. And we're standing there in this environment of real, it's quite cool. I mean, cool in terms of temperature. And I'm surrounded by walk-on parts from a TV movie. They're all dressed in their perfectly turned out tunics, their sleeves rolled up to regulation length, their caps pulled down right to their noses, and their heads back so that they can see where they're going, and their shades. Dressed remarkably. These are prison officers, Barwon prison style. And I turned to Bree and said, "Geez, Bree, I think we've walked right onto the set of Reservoir Dogs." So even in those moments of high tension, even in those moments of real pain and suffering, there is always a degree of humor. There are always moments like coming across the fishman of Edinburgh Prison, who on a whim decided to start breeding fish. And the prison liked this idea. So they had a whole room given over to him. They didn't have a room for all sorts of other stuff, but they gave it over to him because he was great. When people came round the prison, they could say, "Look, we even have a man who breeds fish. And look how successful he is." And those fish were then given to pet shops and so on and so forth. And he became a bit of a celebrity. And the prison, therefore, lived off that celebrity while others were living in dreadful conditions. And I've never forgot me leaving. And I looked at him and I said, you know, Jock, the imprisoned man and the lockdown fish. That was it.
Excellent. It wasn't an easy task to end on a laugh, but I think you managed it. So thank you for that, for the fabulous talk and for the excellent Q&A. If I wasn't being told to stop, I would carry on all night. We're all going to go to the Lock-ins Razor now. If you want to join us in our Zoom pub, I'd also like to thank everyone behind the scenes. I am only the occasional on-screen talent. There's a whole army of people who have been working frantically to make the tech work on this occasion and all the previous weeks. So I'd like just to thank all of them, and my my backup co-host Clea, who was here to step in should my tech have failed. And thanks everyone, and hopefully see you in the pub shortly. Bye-bye.
Thanks a million. Bye.